Chapter 15 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The photograph explained. That evening I went to see Philip Crawford. As one of the executors of his late brother's estate, and as probable heir to the same, he was an important personage just now. He seemed glad to see me, and glad to discuss ways and means of running down the assassin. Like Mr. Porter, he attached little importance to the gold bag. "I can't help thinking it belongs to Florence," he said. "I know the girl so well, and I know that her horrified fear of being in any way connected with the tragedy might easily lead her to disown her own property, thinking the occasion justified the untruth. The girl has no more guilty knowledge of Joseph's death than I have, and that is absolutely none. I tell you frankly, Mr. Burroughs, I haven't even a glimmer of suspicion of anyone. I can't think of an enemy my brother had. He was the most easy-going of men. I never knew him to quarrel with anybody. So I trust that you, with your detective talent, can at least find a clue to lead us in the right direction." "You don't admit the gold bag as a clue, then?" I asked. "Nonsense, no. If that were a clue, it would point to some woman who came secretly at night to visit Joseph. My brother was not that sort of man, sir. He had no feminine acquaintances that were unknown to his relatives." "That is, you suppose so." "I know it. We have been brothers for 60 years or more, and whatever Joseph's faults, they did not lie in that direction. No, sir. If that bag is not Florence's, then there is some other rational and commonplace explanation of its presence there." "I'm glad to hear you speak so positively, Mr. Crawford, as to your brother's feminine acquaintances. And in connection with the subject, I would like to show you this photograph which I found in his desk." I handed the card to Mr. Crawford, whose features broke into a smile as he looked at it. "Oh, that," he said. "That is a picture of Mrs. Patton." He looked at the picture with a glance that seemed to be of admiring reminiscence, and he studied the gentle face of the photograph a moment without speaking. Then he said, "She was beautiful as a girl. She used to be a school friend of both Joseph and myself." "She wrote rather an affectionate message on the back," I observed. Mr. Crawford turned the picture over. "Oh, she didn't send this picture to Joseph. She sent it to my wife last Christmas. I took it over to show it to Joseph some months ago, and left it there without thinking much about it. He probably laid it in his desk without thinking much about it either. No, no, Burroughs, there is no romance there, and you can't connect Mrs. Patton with any of your detective investigations." I'd rather thought that Mr. Crawford, for this is evidently a sweet, simple-minded lady, and moreover nothing has turned up to indicate that Mr. Crawford had a romantic interest of any kind. "No, he didn't. I knew Joseph as I know myself. No, whoever killed my brother was a man, some villain who had a motive that I know nothing about." "But you were intimately acquainted with your brother's affairs?" "Yes, that is what proves to me that whoever this assassin was, it was someone of whose motive I know nothing. The fact that my brother was murdered proves to me that my brother had an enemy, but I had never suspected it before." "Do you know a Mrs. Egerton Purvis?" I flung the question at him suddenly, hoping to catch him unawares, but he only looked at me with the blank expression of one who hears a name for the first time. "No," he answered, "I never heard of her. Who is she?" "Well, when I was hunting through that gold mesh bag, I discovered a lady's visiting card with that name on it. It had slipped between the linings, and so had not been noticed before." To my surprise, this piece of information seemed to annoy Mr. Crawford greatly. "No!" he exclaimed. "In the bag? Then some one has put it there, for I looked all over that bag's contents myself." "It was between the pocket and the lining," said I. "It is still there, for as I felt sure no one else would discover it, I left it there. Mr. Goodrich has the bag." "Oh, I don't want to see it!" he exclaimed angrily. "And I tell you anyway, Mr. Burroughs, that bag is worthless as a clue. Take my advice and pay no further attention to it." I couldn't understand Mr. Crawford's decided attitude against the bag as a clue, but I dropped the subject, for I didn't wish to tell him I had made plans to trace up that visiting card. "It is difficult to find anything that is a real clue," I said. "Yes, indeed. The whole affair is mysterious, and for my part, I cannot form even a conjecture as to who the villain might have been. He certainly left no trace." "Where is the revolver?" I said, picturing the scene in imagination. Philip Crawford started as if caught unawares. "How do I know?" he cried almost angrily. "I tell you I have no suspicions. I wish I had. I desire above all things to bring my brother's murderer to justice. But I don't know where to look. If the weapon were not missing, I should think it a suicide. The doctor declares it could not have been suicide, even if the weapon had been found near him. This they learned from the position of his arms and head. Yes, yes, I know it. It was without doubt murder. But who would have a motive? They say, I observed, motives for murders are usually love, revenge, or money. There is no question of love or revenge in this instance, and as for money, as I am the one who has profited financially, suspicion should rest on me." "Absurd," I said. "Yes, it is absurd," he went on, "for had I desired Joseph's fortune, I need not have killed him to acquire it. He told me the day before he died that he intended to disinherit Florence and make me his heir unless she broke with that secretary of his. I tried to dissuade him from this step, for we are not a mercenary lot, we Crawfords, and I thought I had made him reconsider his decision. Now, as it turns out, he persisted in his resolve, and was only prevented from carrying it out by this midnight assassin. We must find that villain, Mr. Burroughs. Do not consider expense. Do anything you can to track him down." "Then, Mr. Crawford," said I, "if you do not mind the outlay, I advise that we send for Fleming Stone. He is a detective of extraordinary powers, and I am quite willing to surrender the case to him." Philip Crawford eyed me keenly. "You give up easily, young man," he said banteringly. "I know it seems so," I replied, "but I have my reasons. One is that Fleming Stone makes important deductions from seemingly unimportant clues, and he holds that unless these clues are followed immediately, they are lost sight of, and great opportunities are gone." Mused Philip Crawford, stroking his strong, square chin. "I don't care much for these spectacular detectives. Your man, I suppose, would glance at the gold bag and at once announce the age, sex, and previous condition of servitude of its owner." "Just what I have thought, Mr. Crawford. I'm sure he could do just that." "And that's all the good it would do. The bag doesn't belong to the criminal." "How do you know?" "By common sense. No woman came to the house in the dead of night and shot my brother and then departed, taking the revolver with her. And again, granting a woman did have nerve and strength enough to do that, such a woman is not going off leaving her gold bag behind her as evidence." The speech didn't affect me much. It was pure conjecture. Women are uncertain creatures at best, and a woman capable of murder would be equally capable of losing her head afterward and leaving circumstantial evidence behind her. I was sorry Mr. Crawford didn't seem to take the notion of sending for Stone. I wasn't weakening in the case, so far as my confidence in my own ability was concerned, but I could see no direction to look except toward Florence Lloyd or Gregory Hall, or both, and so I was ready to give up. "What do you think of Gregory Hall?" I said suddenly. "As a man or as a suspect?" inquired Mr. Crawford. "Both. Well, as a man, I think he's about the average, ordinary young American, of the secretary type. He has little real ambition, but he has had a good berth with Joseph, and he has worked fairly hard to keep it. As a suspect, the notion is absurd. He wasn't even in West Sedgwick." "How do you know?" "Because he went away at 6 that evening and was in New York until nearly noon the next day." "How do you know?" Philip Crawford stared at me. "He says so," I went on, "but no one can prove his statement. He refuses to say where he was in New York or what he did. Now, merely as a supposition, why couldn't he have come out here, say on the midnight train, called on Mr. Joseph Crawford, and returned to New York before daylight?" "Absurd. Why, he had no motive for killing Joseph." "He had the same motive Florence would have. He knew of Mr. Crawford's objection to their union, and he knew of his threat to change his will. Mr. Hall is not blind to the advantages of a fortune." "Right you are there. In fact, I always felt he was marrying Florence for her money. I had no real reason to think this, but somehow he gave me that impression. Me too. Moreover, I found a late extra of a New York paper in Mr. Crawford's office. This wasn't on sale until about 11:30 that night, so whoever left it there must have come out from the city on that midnight train or later." A change came over Philip Crawford's face. Apparently, he was brought to see the whole matter in a new light. What's that?" he cried excitedly, grasping his chair arms and half rising. "A late newspaper? An extra?" "Yes, the liner accident, you know." "But Gregory Hall! Why, man, you're crazy. Hall's a good fellow. Not remarkably clever, perhaps, and a fortune hunter, maybe, but surely not a murderer." "Don't take it so hard, Mr. Crawford," I broke in. "Probably Mr. Hall is innocent, but the late paper must have been left there by someone, after, say, 1 o'clock." "This is awful. This is terrible," groaned the poor man, and I couldn't help wondering if he had some other evidence against Hall that this seemed to corroborate. Then, by an effort, he recovered himself and began to talk in more normal tones. "Now, don't let this new idea run away with you, Mr. Burroughs," he said. "If Hall had an interview with my brother that night, he would have learned from him that he intended to make a new will, but hadn't yet done so." "Exactly, and that would constitute a motive for putting Mr. Crawford out of the way before he could accomplish his purpose." "But Joseph had already destroyed the will that favored Florence." "We don't know that," I responded gravely, "and anyway, if he had done so, Mr. Hall didn't know it. This leaves his motive unchanged." "But the gold bag," said Mr. Crawford, apparently to get away from the subject of Gregory Hall. "If, as you say," I began, "that is Florence's bag—" I couldn't go on. A strange sense of duty had forced those words from me, but I could say no more. Fleming Stone might take the case if they wanted him to, or they might get someone else. But I could not go on, when the only clues discoverable pointed in a way I dared not look. Philip Crawford was ghastly now. His face was working, and he breathed quickly. "Nonsense, Dad!" cried a strong young voice, and his son Philip Jr. bounded into the room and grasped his father's hands. "I overheard a few of your last words, and you two are on the wrong track. Florrie's no more mixed up in that horrible business than I am. Neither is Hall. He's a fool chap, but no villain. I heard what you said about the late newspaper, but lots of people come out on that midnight train. You may as well suspect some peaceable citizen coming home from the theater as to pick out poor Hall without a scrap of evidence to point to him." I was relieved beyond all words at the hearty assurance of the boy, and I plucked up new courage. Apprehension had made me faint-hearted, but if he could show such flawless confidence in Florence and her betrothed, surely I could do as much. "Good for you, young man," I cried, shaking his hand. "You've cheered me up a lot. I'll take a fresh start, and surely we'll find out something. But I'd like to send for Stone." Wait a bit," said Mr. Crawford. "Philip's right. There's no possibility of Florrie or Hall in the matter. Leave the gold bag, the newspapers, and the yellow posies out of consideration, and go to work in some sensible way." "How about Mr. Joseph's finances?" I asked. "Are they in satisfactory shape?" "Never finer," said Philip Crawford. "Joseph was a very rich man, and all due to his own clever and careful investments. A bit of a speculator, but always on the right side of the market. Why, he fairly had a corner in XY stock. Just that deal, and it will go through in a few days, means a fortune in itself. I shall settle that on Florence." "Then you think the will never be found?" I said. Mr. Crawford looked a little ashamed, as well he might, but he only said, "If it is, no one will be more glad than I to see Florrie reinstated in her own right. If no will turns up, Joe's estate is legally mine, but I shall see that Florence is amply provided for." He spoke with a proud dignity, and I was rather sorry I had caught him up so sharply. I went back to the inn, and after vainly racking my brain over it all, for a time I turned in, but to a miserably broken night's rest. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A call on Mrs. Purvis. The next morning I received information from headquarters. It was a long code telegram, and I eagerly deciphered it, to learn that Mrs. Egerton Purvis was an English lady who was spending a few months in New York City. She was staying at the Albion Hotel, and seemed to be in every way above suspicion of any sort. Of course, I started off at once to see Mrs. Purvis. Parmalee came just as I was leaving the inn, and was of course anxious and inquisitive to know where I was going, and what I was going to do. At first I thought I would take him into my confidence, and I even thought of taking him with me, but I felt sure that I could do better work alone. It might be that Mrs. Egerton Purvis should turn out to be an important factor in the case, and I suppose it was really an instinct of vanity that made me prefer to look her up without Parmalee by my side. So I told him that I was going to New York on a matter in connection with the case, and that I preferred to go alone, but I would tell him the entire result of my mission as soon as I returned. I think he was a little disappointed, but he was a good-natured chap, and bade me a cheerful good-bye, saying he would meet me on my return. I went to New York and went straight to the Albion Hotel. Learning at the desk that the lady was really there, I sent my card up to her with a request for an immediate audience, and very soon I was summoned to her apartment. She greeted me with that air of frigid reserve typical of an Englishwoman. Though not unattractive to look at, she possessed the high cheekbones and prominent teeth which are almost universal in the women of her nation. She was perhaps between 30 and 40 years old, and had the air of a grande dame. "Mr. Burroughs," she said, looking through her lorgnon at my card, which she held in her hand. "Yes," I assented, and judging from her appearance that she was a woman of a decided and straightforward nature, I came at once to the point. "I am a detective, madam," I began, and the remark startled her out of her calm. "A detective!" she cried out, with much the same tone as if I had said a rattlesnake. "Do not be alarmed. I merely state my profession to explain my errand." "Not be alarmed when a detective comes to see me? How can I help it? Why, I've never had such an experience before. It is shocking. I've met many queer people in the States, but not a detective. Reporters are bad enough." "Don't let it disturb you so, Mrs. Purvis. I assure you there is nothing to trouble you in the fact of my presence here, unless it is trouble of your own making." "Trouble of my own making!" she almost shrieked. "Tell me at once what you mean, or I shall ring the bell and have you dismissed." Her fear and excitement made me think that perhaps I was on the track of new developments, and lest she should carry out her threat of ringing the bell, I plunged at once into the subject. "Mrs. Purvis, have you lost a gold mesh bag?" I said bluntly. "No, I haven't," she snapped. "And if I had, I should take means to recover it, and not wait for a detective to come and ask me about it." I was terribly disappointed. To be sure, she might be telling a falsehood about the bag, but I didn't think so. She was angry, annoyed, and a little frightened at my intrusion, but she was not all embarrassed at my question. "Are you quite sure you have not lost a gold link bag?" I insisted, as if in idiotic endeavor to persuade her to have done so. "Of course I'm sure," she replied, half laughing now. "I suppose I should know if I had done so." "It's a rather valuable bag," I went on, "with a gold framework and gold chain." "Well, if it's worth a whole fortune, it isn't my bag," she declared, "for I never owned such a one." "Well," I said in desperation, "your visiting card is in it." "My visiting card!" she said, with an expression of blank wonderment. "Well, even if that is true, it doesn't make it my bag. I frequently give my cards to other people." This seemed to promise light at last. Somehow I couldn't doubt her assertion that it was not her bag, and yet the thought suddenly occurred to me, if she were clever enough to be implicated in the Crawford tragedy, and if she had left her bag there, she would be expecting this inquiry, and would probably be clever enough to have a story prepared. "Mrs. Purvis, since you say it's not your bag, I'm going to ask you, in the interest of justice, to help me all you can." "I am quite willing to do so, sir. What is it you wish to know?" "A crime has been committed in a small town in New Jersey. A gold-linked bag was afterward discovered at the scene of the crime, and though none of its other contents betokened its owner, a visiting card with your name on it was in the bag." Becoming interested in the story, Mrs. Purvis seemed to get over her fright, and was exceedingly sensible for a woman. "It certainly is not my bag, Mr. Burroughs, and if my card is in it, I can only say that I must have given that card to the lady who owns the bag." This seemed distinctly plausible, and also promised further information. "Do you remember giving your card to any lady with such a bag?" Mrs. Purvis smiled. "So many of your American women carry those bags," she said. "They seem to be almost universal this year. I have probably given my card to a score of ladies, who immediately put it into just such a bag." "Could you tell me who they are?" "No, indeed," and Mrs. Purvis almost laughed outright at what was doubtless a foolish question. "But can't you help me in any way?" I pleaded. "I don't really see how I can," she replied. "You see, I have so many friends in New York, and they make little parties for me, or afternoon teas. Then I meet a great many American ladies, and we often exchange cards. But we do it so often that of course I can't remember every particular instance. Have you the card you speak of?" I thanked my stars that I had been thoughtful enough to obtain the card before leaving West Sedgwick, and taking it from my pocketbook, I gave it to her. "Oh, that one," she said. "Perhaps I can help you a little, Mr. Burroughs. That is an old-fashioned card, one of the few left over from an old lot. I have been using them only lately, because my others gave out. I have really gone much more into society in New York than I had anticipated, and my cards seem to fairly melt away. I ordered some new ones here, but before they were sent to me I was obliged to use a few of these old-fashioned ones. I don't know that this would help you, but I think I can tell pretty nearly to whom I gave those cards." It seemed a precarious sort of a chance, but as I talked with Mrs. Purvis, I felt more and more positive that she herself was not implicated in the Crawford case. However, it was just as well to make certain. She had gone to her writing desk and seemed to be looking over a diary or engagement book. "Mrs. Purvis," I said, "will you tell me where you were on Tuesday evening of last week?" "Certainly," and she turned back to the leaves of the book. "I went to a theatre party with my friends, the Hepworths, and afterwards we went to a little supper at a restaurant. I returned here about midnight. Must I prove this?" she added, smiling, "for I can probably do so by the hotel clerk and by my maid, and of course by my friends who gave the party." "No, you needn't prove it," I answered, certain now that she knew nothing of the Crawford matter. "But I hope you can give me more information about your card." "Why, I remember that very night. I gave my cards to two ladies who were at the theatre with us, and I remember now that at that time I had only these old-fashioned cards. I was rather ashamed of them, for Americans are punctilious in such matters, and now that I think of it, one of the ladies was carrying a gold mesh bag." "Who was she?" I asked, hardly daring to hope that I had really struck the trail. "I can't seem to remember her name, but perhaps it will come to me. It was rather an English type of name, something like Coningsby." "Where did she live?" "I haven't the slightest idea, you see. I meet these ladies so casually, and I never really expect to see any of them again. Our exchange of cards is a mere bit of formal courtesy. No, I can't remember her name, or where she was from, but I don't think she was a New Yorker." True, it was hard to come so near getting what might be vital information, yet have it beyond my grasp. It was quite evident that Mrs. Purvis was honestly trying to remember the lady's name, but could not do so. And then I had what seemed to me an inspiration. "Didn't she give you her card?" I asked. A light broke over Mrs. Purvis's face. "Why, yes, of course she did, and I'm sure I can find it." She turned to a card tray, and rapidly running over the bits of pasteboard, she selected 3 or 4. "Here they are," she exclaimed, "all here together. I mean all the cards that were given me on that particular evening. And here's the name I couldn't think of. It is Mrs. Cunningham. I remember distinctly that she carried a gold bag, and no one else in the party did, for we were admiring it. And here is her address on the card, Marathon Park, New Jersey." I almost fainted myself with the suddenness of the discovery, Had I really found the name and address of the owner of the gold bag? Of course, there might be a slip yet, but the evidence seemed clear that Mrs. Cunningham of Marathon Park owned the bag that had been the subject of so much speculation. I had no idea where Marathon Park might be, but that was a mere detail. I thanked Mrs. Purvis sincerely for the help she had given me, and I was glad I had not told her that her casual acquaintance was perhaps implicated in a murder mystery. I made my adieux and returned at once to West Sedgwick. As he had promised, Parmalee met me at the station, and I told him the whole story, for I thought him entitled to the information at once. "Why, man alive!" he exclaimed. "Marathon Park is the very next station to West Sedgwick." "So it is," I said. "I knew I had a hazy idea of seeing the name, but the trains I have taken to and from New York have been expresses, which didn't stop there, and I paid no attention to it." "It's a small park," went on Parmalee, "of swagger residences. Very exclusive and reserved, you know. You've certainly unearthed startling news, but I can't help thinking that it will be a wild goose chase that leads us to look for our criminal in Marathon Park." "What do you think we'd better do?" said I. "Go see Miss Cunningham?" "No, I wouldn't do that," said Parmalee, who had a sort of plebeian hesitancy at the thought of intruding upon aristocratic strangers. "Suppose you write her a letter and just ask her if she's lost her bag." "All right," I conceded, for to tell the truth, I greatly preferred to stay in West Sedgwick than to go out of it, for I had always the undefined hope of seeing Florence Lloyd. So I wrote a letter, not exactly curt, but strictly formal, asking Mrs. Cunningham if she had recently lost a gold mesh bag containing her gloves and a handkerchief. Then Parmalee and I agreed to keep the matter a secret until we should get a reply to this, for we concluded there was no use in stirring up public curiosity on the matter until we knew ourselves that we were on the right trail. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The owner of the gold bag. The next day I received a letter addressed in modish, angular penmanship, which, before I opened it, I felt sure had come from Mrs. Cunningham. It ran as follows: Mr. Herbert Burroughs, Dear Sir, Yes, I have lost a gold bag, and I have known all along that it is the one the newspapers are talking so much about in connection with the Crawford case. I know, too, that you are the detective on the case, and though I can't imagine how you did it, I think it was awfully clever of you to trace the bag to me, for I'm sure my name wasn't in it anywhere. As I say, the bag is mine, but I didn't kill Mr. Crawford, and I don't know who did. I would go straight to you and tell you all about it, but I am afraid of detectives and lawyers, and I don't want to be mixed up in the affair anyway. But I am going to see Miss Lloyd and explain it all to her, and then she can tell you. Please don't let my name get in the papers, as I hate that sort of prominence. Very truly yours, Elizabeth Cunningham. I smiled a little over the femininity of the letter, but as Parmalee had prophesied, Marathon Park was evidently no place to look for our criminal. The foolish little woman who had written that letter had no guilty secret on her conscience, of that I was sure. I telephoned for Parmalee and showed him the letter. "It doesn't help us in one way," he said, "for of course Mrs. Cunningham is not implicated, but the bag is still a clue, for how did it get into Mr. Crawford's office?" "We must find out who Mr. Cunningham is," I suggested. "He's not the criminal either. If he had left his wife's bag there, he never would have let her send this letter. Perhaps he didn't know she wrote it. Or perhaps a lot of things, but I'm anxious to learn what Mrs. Cunningham tells Miss Lloyd. Let's go over to the Crawford house and tell Miss Lloyd about it." "Not this morning. I've another engagement, and besides, the little lady won't get around so soon." "Why a little lady?" I asked, smiling. "Oh, the whole tone of the letter seems to imply a little yellow-haired butterfly of a woman." "Just the reverse of Florence Lloyd," I said musingly. "Yes, no one could imagine Miss Lloyd writing a letter like that. There's lots of personality in a woman's letter, much more than in a man's." Parmalee went away, and prompted by his suggestion, I studied the letter I had just received. It was merely an idle fancy, for if Mrs. Cunningham was going to tell Miss Lloyd her story, it made little difference to me what might be her stature or the color of her hair. But probably because of Parmalee's suggestion, I pictured her to myself as a pretty young woman, with that air of half innocence and half ignorance which so well becomes the plump blonde type. The broad veranda of the Sedgwick Arms was a pleasant place to sit, and I had mused there for some time when Mr. Carstairs came out to tell me that I was asked for on the telephone. The call proved to be from Florence Lloyd, asking me to come to her at once. Only too glad to obey this summons, I went directly to the Crawford house, wondering if any new evidence had been brought to light. Lambert opened the door for me and ushered me into the library, where Florence was receiving a lady caller. "Mrs. Cunningham," said Florence, as I entered, "may I present Mr. Burroughs, Mr. Herbert Burroughs. I sent for you," she added, turning to me, "because Mrs. Cunningham has an important story to tell, and I thought you ought to hear it at once." I bowed politely to the stranger and awaited her disclosures. Mrs. Cunningham was a pretty, frivolous-looking woman, with appealing blue eyes and a manner half childish, half apologetic. I smiled involuntarily to see how nearly her appearance coincided with the picture in my mind, and I greeted her almost as if she were a previous acquaintance. "I know I have done very wrong," she began, with a nervous little flutter of her pretty hands, "but I'm ready now to 'fess up, as the children say." She looked at me, so sure of an answering smile that I gave it, and said, "Let us hear your confession, Mrs. Cunningham. I doubt if it's a very dreadful one." "Well, you see," she went on, "that gold bag is mine." "Yes," I said. "How did it get here?" "I've no idea," she replied, and I could see that her shallow nature fairly exulted in the sensation she was creating. "I went to New York that night, to the theatre, and I carried my gold bag, and I left it in the train when I got out at the station." "West Sedgwick?" I asked. "No, I live at Marathon Park, the next station to this." "Next on the way to New York?" "Yes, and when I got out of the train I was with my husband and some other people. We had been to a little theatre party. I missed the bag. But I didn't tell Jack, because I knew he'd scold me for being so careless. I thought I'd get it back from the Lost and Found department, and then, the very next day, I read in the paper about the awful accident, and it told about a gold bag being found here." "You recognized it as yours?" "Of course, for the paper described everything in it, even to the cleaner's advertisement that I had just cut out that very day." "Why didn't you come and claim it at once?" "Oh, Mr. Burroughs, you must know why I didn't. Why, I was scared most to death to read the accounts of the terrible affair, and to mix in it myself. Ugh! I couldn't dream of anything so horrible." It was absurd, but I had a desire to shake the silly little bundle of femininity who told this really important story, with the twitters and simpers of a silly schoolgirl. "And you would not have come if I had not written you?" She hesitated. "I think I should have come soon, even without your letter." "Why, Mrs. Cunningham?" "Well, I kept it secret for as long as I could, but yesterday Jack saw that I had something on my mind. I couldn't fool him any longer." "As to your having a mind," I said to myself, but I made no comment aloud. So I told him all about it, and he said I must come at once and tell Miss Lloyd, because, you see, they thought it was her bag all the time. "Yes," I said gravely, "it would have been better if you had come at first with your story. Have you anyone to substantiate it, or any proofs that it is the truth?" The blue eyes regarded me with an injured expression. Then she brightened again. "Oh, yes, I can prove property. That's what you mean, isn't it? I can tell you which glove finger is ripped, and just how much money is in the bag, and here's a handkerchief exactly like the one I carried that night. Jack said if I told you all these things, you'd know it's my bag and not Miss Lloyd's." "And then there was a card in it?" "Card? My card?" "No, not your card. A card with another name on it."
"Don't you know whose?"
Mrs. Cunningham thought for a moment. Then "Oh, yes!" she exclaimed. "Mrs. Purvis gave me her card, and I tucked it in the pocket of the bag. Was that the way you discovered the bag was mine? And how did that make you know it?" "I'll tell you about that some other time, if you wish, Mrs. Cunningham, but just now I want to get at the important part of your story. How did your gold bag get into Mr. Crawford's office?" "Ah, how did it?" The laughing face was sober now, and she seemed appalled at the question. "Jack says someone must have found it in the car seat where I left it. And he," she lowered her voice, "he must be the murderer," I supplied calmly. "It does look that way. You have witnesses, I suppose, who saw you in that train?" "Mercy, yes, lots of them. The train reaches Marathon Park at 12:50 and is due here at 1 o'clock. Ever so many people got out at our station. There were 6 in our own party and others besides. And the conductor knows me, and everybody knows Jack. He's Mr. John Leroy Cunningham." It was impossible to doubt all this. Further corroboration it might be well to get, but there was not the slightest question in my mind as to the little lady's truthfulness. "I thank you, Mrs. Cunningham," I said, "for coming to us with your story. You may not be able to get your bag today, but I assure you it will be sent to you as soon as a few inquiries can be made. These are merely for the sake of formalities, for, as you say, your fellow townspeople can certify to your presence on the train, and your leaving it at Marathon Park Station." "Yes," she replied, and she handed me a paper. "There's my husband's address, and his lawyer's address, and the addresses of all the people that were in our party that night. Jack said you might like to have a list. He would have come himself today, only he's fearfully busy, and I said I didn't mind coming alone, just to see Miss Lloyd. I wouldn't have gone to a jury meeting, though, and I'm in no hurry for the bag. In fact, I don't care much if I never get it. It wasn't the value of the thing that made me come at all, but the fear that my bag might make trouble for Miss Lloyd. Jack said it might. I don't see how myself, but I'm a foolish little thing with no head for business matters." She shook her head and gurgled an absurd little laugh, and then, after a loquacious leave-taking, she went away. "Well," I said to Florence, and then, "Well," Florence said to me. It was astonishing how rapidly our acquaintance had progressed. Already we laid aside all formality of speech and manner, and if the girl had not really discovered my mental attitude toward her, at least I think she must have suspected it. "Of course," I began, "I knew it wasn't your bag because you said it wasn't. But I did incline a little to the woman visitor theory, and now that is destroyed, I think we must conclude that the bag was brought here by the person who found it on that midnight train." "Why didn't that person turn it over to the conductor?" she said, more as if thinking to herself than speaking to me. "Yes, why indeed?" I echoed. "And if he brought it here and committed a criminal act, why go away and leave it here?" I think it was at the same moment that the minds of both of us turned to Gregory Hall. Her eyes fell, and as for me, I was nearly stunned with the thoughts that came rushing to my brain. If the late newspaper had seemed to point to Hall's coming out on that late train, how much more so this bag, which had been left on that very train. We were silent for a time, and then, lifting her sweet eyes bravely to mine, Florence said, "I have something to tell you." "Yes," I replied, crushing down the longing to take her in my arms and let her tell it there. "Mr. Hall had a talk with me this morning. He says that he and the others have searched everywhere possible for the will, and that it cannot be found. He says Uncle Joseph must have destroyed it, and that it is practically settled that Uncle Philip is the legal heir. Of course, Mr. Philip Crawford isn't my uncle, but I have always called him that, and Phil and I have been just like cousins." "What else did Mr. Hall say?" I asked, for I divined that the difficult part of her recital was yet to come. "He said," she went on, with a rising color, "that he wished me to break our engagement. I will do myself the justice to say that although my first uncontrollable thought was one of pure joy at this revelation, yet it was instantly followed by sympathy and consideration for her. "Why?" I asked in a voice that I tried to keep from being hard. He says," she continued, with a note of weariness in her voice, "that he is not a rich man, and cannot give me the comforts and luxuries to which I have been accustomed, and that therefore it is only right for him to release me." "Of course you didn't accept his generous sacrifice," I said, and my own hopes ran riot as I listened to her answer. "I told him I was willing to share poverty with him," she said, with a quiet dignity, as if telling an impersonal tale, "but he insisted that the engagement should be broken." "And is it?" I asked eagerly, almost breathlessly. She gave me that look which always rebuked me, always put me back in my place, but which, it seemed to me, was a little less severe than ever before. "It's left undecided for a day or two," she said. Then she added hurriedly, "I must see if he needs me. Do you suppose this story of Mrs. Cunningham's will in any way, affect him?" "It may," I replied truthfully. "At any rate, he must be made to tell where he was and what he was doing Tuesday night. You have no idea, have you?" Florence hesitated a moment, looked at me in a way I could not fathom, and then, but only after a little choking sound in her throat, she said, "No, I have no idea." It was impossible to believe her. No one would show such emotion, such difficulty of speech, if telling a simple truth. Yet when I looked in her troubled eyes, and read their anxiety, uncertainty, and misery, I only loved her more than ever. Truly it was time for me to give up this case. Whatever turn it took, I was no fit person to handle clues or evidence which filled me with deadly fear lest they turn against the one I loved. And yet that one, already suspected by many, had been proved to have both motive and opportunity. And I who loved her, knew that, in one instance at least, she had been untruthful. Yes, it was high time for me to give this case into other hands. I looked at her again, steadily, but with a meaning in my glance that I hoped she would understand. I wanted her to know that though, of course, justice was my end and aim, yet I was sure the truth could not implicate her, and if it did implicate Mr. Hall, the sooner we discovered it the better. I think she appreciated my meaning, for the troubled look in her own eyes disappeared, and she seemed suddenly almost willing to give me her full confidence. I resolved to make the most of my opportunity. "Of course you know," I said gently, "that I want to believe all you say to me, but Miss Lloyd, your naturally truthful nature so rebels at your unveracity that it is only too plain to be seen when you are not telling the truth. Now, I do not urge you, but I ask you to tell me confidentially, if you choose, what your surmise is as to Mr. Hall's strange reticence." "It is only a surmise," she said, and though the troubled look came back to her eyes, she looked steadily at me, "and I have no real reason even to think it, but I can't help feeling that Gregory is interested in some other woman beside myself." Again I felt that uncontrollable impulse of satisfaction at this disclosure, and again I stifled it. I endeavored to treat the matter lightly. "Is that all?" I asked. "Do you mean that perhaps Mr. Hall was calling on some other lady acquaintance that evening?" "Yes, that is what I do mean, and, as I say, I have no real reason to think it. But still, Mr. Burroughs, if it were true, I cannot agree with you that it is unimportant. Surely a man is not expected to call on one woman when he is betrothed to another, or at least not to make a secret of it." I thoroughly agreed with her, and my opinion that Hall was a cad received decided confirmation. My treating it as a light matter, Miss Lloyd, was not quite sincere. Indeed, I may as well confess that it was partly to cover the too serious interest I take in the matter. She looked up, startled at this, but as my eyes told her a certain truth I made no effort to conceal, she looked down again, and her lip quivered. I pulled myself together. "Don't think I am taking advantage of your confidence," I said gently. "I only want to help you. Please consider me an impersonal factor, and let me do all I can for you. For the moment, let us suppose your surmise is correct. This would, of course, free Mr. Hall from any implication of crime." "Yes, and while I can't suspect him of anything like crime, I hate also to suspect him of disloyalty to me." Her head went up with a proud gesture, and I suddenly knew that the thought of Hall's interest in another woman affected her pride and her sense of what was due her far more than it did her heart. Her fear was not so much that Hall loved another woman as that his secrecy in the matter meant a slight to her own dignified position. "I understand, Miss Lloyd, and I hope for the sake of all concerned your surmise is not correct. But with your permission, I feel it my duty to discover where Mr. Hall was that evening, even if to do this it is necessary to have professional assistance from headquarters." She shuddered at this. "It is so horrid," she said, "to spy upon a gentleman's movements, if he is only engaged in his personal affairs." "If we were sure of that, we need not spy upon him. But to the eye of justice there is always the possibility that he was not about his personal affairs that evening, but was here in West Sedgwick." "You don't really suspect him, do you?" she said, and she looked at me as if trying to read my very soul. "I'm afraid I do," I answered gravely, "but not so much from evidence against him as because I don't know where else to look. Do you?" "No," said Florence Lloyd. Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In Mr. Goodrich's office. As was my duty, I went next to the district attorney's office to tell him about Mrs. Cunningham and the gold bag, and to find out from him anything I could concerning Gregory Hall. I found Mr. Porter calling there, and both he and Mr. Goodrich welcomed me as a possible bringer of fresh news. When I said that I did know of new developments, Mr. Porter half rose from his chair. "I dare say I've no business here," he said, "but you know the deep interest I take in this whole matter. Joseph Crawford was my lifelong friend and near neighbor, and if I can be in any way instrumental in freeing Florence from this web of suspicion—" I turned on him angrily and interrupted him by saying, "Excuse me, Mr. Porter. No one has as yet voiced a suspicion against Miss Lloyd. For you to put such a thought into words is starting a mine of trouble." The older man looked at me indulgently, and I think his shrewd perceptions told him at once that I was more interested in Miss Lloyd than a mere detective need be. "You are right," he said, "but I considered this a confidential session." "It is," broke in Mr. Goodrich, "and if you will stay, Mr. Porter, I shall be glad to have you listen to whatever Mr. Burroughs has to tell us, and then give us the benefit of your advice." I practically echoed the district attorney's words, for I knew Lemuel Porter to be a clear-headed and well-balanced business man, and his opinions were well worth having. So it was to two very interested hearers that I related first the story of Florence's coming downstairs at 11 o'clock on the fatal night, for a final endeavor to gain her uncle's consent to her betrothal. "Then it was her bag!" exclaimed Mr. Porter. "I thought so all the time." I said nothing at the moment, and listened for Mr. Goodrich's comment. "To my mind," said the district attorney slowly, "this story, now told by Miss Lloyd, is in her favor. If the girl were guilty, or had any guilty knowledge of the crime, she would not have told of this matter at all. It was not forced from her. She told it voluntarily, and I, for one, believe it." "She told it," said I, "because she wished to take the responsibility of the fallen rose petals upon herself. Since we are speaking plainly, I may assure you, gentlemen, that she told of her later visit to the office because I hinted to her that the yellow leaves might implicate Gregory Hall." "Then," said Mr. Goodrich triumphantly, "she herself suspects Mr. Hall, which proves that she is innocent." "It doesn't prove her innocent of collusion," observed Mr. Porter. "Nor does it prove that she suspects Mr. Hall," I added. "It merely shows that she fears others may suspect him." "It is very complicated," said the district attorney. "It is," I agreed, "and that is why I wish to send for the famous detective, Fleming Stone." "Stone? Nonsense!" exclaimed Mr. Goodrich. "I have every confidence in your skill, Mr. Burroughs. I would not insult you by calling in another detective." "Surely not," agreed Mr. Porter. "If you need help, Mr. Burroughs, confer with our local man, Mr. Parmalee. He's a pretty clever chap. and I don't know why you two don't work more together." "We do work together," said I. "Mr. Parmalee is both clever and congenial, and we have done our best in the matter. But the days are going by, and little of real importance has been discovered. However, I haven't told you as yet the story of the gold bag. I have found its owner." Of course there were exclamations of surprise at this, but realizing its importance, they quietly listened to my story. With scarcely a word of interruption from my hearers, I told them how I had found the card in the bag, how I had learned about Mrs. Purvis from headquarters, how I had gone to see her, and how it had all resulted in Mrs. Cunningham's visit to Miss Lloyd that morning. "Well," exclaimed Mr. Porter, as I concluded the narrative, "well, of all things! Well, I'm amazed. Why, this gives a wide scope of possibilities. Scores of our people come out on that theater train every night." "But not scores of people would have a motive for putting Joseph Crawford out of the way," said Mr. Goodrich, who sat perplexedly frowning. Then, by way of a trump card, I told them of the extra edition of the evening paper I had found in the office. The district attorney stared at me, but still sat frowning and silent. But Mr. Porter expressed his wonderment. "How it all fits in!" he cried. "The bag, known to be from that late train. The paper, known to have been brought late in New York. Burroughs, you are a wonder. Indeed, we don't want any Fleming Stone when you can do such clever sleuthing as this." I stared at him. Nothing I had done seemed to me clever sleuthing, nor did my simple discoveries seem to me of any great significance. "I don't like it," said Mr. Goodrich at last. "Everything so far known, both early and late information, seems to me to point to Gregory Hall and Florence Lloyd in collusion." "But you said," I interrupted, "that Miss Lloyd's confession that she did go downstairs late at night was in her favor." "I said that before I knew about this bag story. Now I think the case is altered, and the two who had real motive are undoubtedly the suspects." "But they had no motive," said Mr. Porter, "since Florence doesn't inherit the fortune." "But they thought she did," explained the district attorney, "and so the motive was just as strong. Mr. Burroughs, I wish you would confer with Mr. Parmalee, and both of you set to work on the suggestions I have advanced. It is a painful outlook, to be sure, but justice is inexorable. You agree with me, Mr. Porter?" Mr. Porter started, as if he, too, had been in a brown study. "I do and I don't," he said. "Personally, I think both those young people are innocent, but if I am correct, no harm will be done by a further investigation of their movements on Tuesday night. I think Mr. Hall ought to tell where he was that night, if only in self-defense. If he proves he was in New York and did not come out here, it will not only clear him, but also Florence, for I think no one suspects her of anything more than collusion with him." Of course I had no mind to tell these men what Florence had told me confidentially about Mr. Hall's possible occupation Tuesday evening. They were determined to investigate that very question, and so, if her surmise were correct, it would disclose itself. "Very well," I said, after listening to a little further discussion, which was really nothing but repetition. "Then I will consult with Mr. Parmalee, and we will try to make further investigation of Mr. Hall's doings. But I am ready to admit that it does not look easy to me to discover anything of importance. Mr. Hall is a secretive man, and unless we have a definite charge against him, it is difficult to make him talk." "Well, you can certainly learn something," said Mr. Goodrich. "At any rate, devote a few days to the effort. I have confidence in you, Mr. Burroughs, and I don't think you need to call in a man whom you consider your superior. But if you'll excuse me for making a suggestion, let me ask you to remember that a theory of Hall's guilt also possibly implicates Miss Lloyd. You will probably discover this for yourself, but don't let your natural chivalry toward a woman, and perhaps a personal element in this case, blind you to the facts." Although he put it delicately, I quite understood that he had noticed my personal interest in Florence Lloyd, and so, as it was my duty to disregard that interest in my work, I practically promised to remember his injunction. It was then that I admitted to myself the true state of my mind. I felt sure Florence was innocent, but I knew appearances were strongly against her, and I feared I should bungle the case because of the very intensity of my desire not to. And I thought that Fleming Stone, in spite of evidence, would be able to prove what I felt was the truth, that Florence was guiltless of all knowledge or complicity in her uncle's death. However, I had promised to go on with the quest, and I urged myself on with the hope that further developments might clear Florence, even if they more deeply implicated Gregory Hall. I went back to the inn and spent some time in thinking over the matter and methodically recording my conclusions. And while I thought I became more and more convinced that, whether Florence connived or not, Hall was the villain, and that he had actually slain his employer because he had threatened to disinherit his niece. Perhaps when Hall came to the office late that night, Mr. Crawford was already engaged in drawing up the new will, and in order to purloin it, Hall had killed him, not knowing that the other will was already destroyed. And destroyed it must be, for surely Hall had no reason to steal or suppress the will that favored Florence. As a next move, I decided to interview Mr. Hall. Such talks as I had had with him so far had been interrupted and unsatisfactory. Now I would see him alone and learn something from his manner and appearance. I found him, as I expected, in the office of his late employer. He was surrounded with papers and was evidently very busy, but he greeted me with a fair show of cordiality and offered me a chair. "I want to talk to you plainly, Mr. Hall," I said, "and as I see you're busy, I will be as brief as possible." "I've been expecting you," he said calmly. "In fact, I'm rather surprised that you haven't been here before." "Why?" said I, eyeing him closely. "Only because the inquiries made at the inquest amounted to very little, and I assumed you would question all the members of the household again." "I'm not sure that's necessary," I responded, following his example in adopting a light, casual tone. "I have no reason to suspect that the servants told other than the exact truth. I have talked to both the ladies, and now I've only a few questions to put to you." He looked up, surprised at my self-satisfied air. "Have you nailed the criminal?" he asked, with a greater show of interest than he had before evinced. "Not exactly nailed him, perhaps, but we fancy we are on the scent." "Resent what?" he asked, looking blank. "I didn't say resent. I said we were on the scent." "Oh, yes. And in what direction does it lead you?" "In your direction," I said, willing to try what effect bluntness might have upon this composed young man. "I beg your pardon," he said, as if he hadn't heard me. "Evidences are pointing toward you as the criminal," I said, determined to disturb his composure if I could. Instead of showing surprise or anger, he gave a slight smile, as one would at an idea too ridiculous to be entertained for an instant. Somehow, that smile was more convincing to me than any verbal protestations could have been. Then I realized that the man was doubtless a consummate actor, and he had carefully weighed the value of that supercilious smile against asseveration of innocence. So I went on. "When did you first learn of the accident to the Atlantic liner, the North America?" "I suppose you mean that question for a trap," he said coolly, "but I haven't the least objection to answering it. I bought a late extra in New York City the night of the disaster." "At what hour did you buy it?" "I don't know exactly. It was some time after midnight." Really, there was little use in questioning this man. If he had bought his paper at 11:30, as I felt positive he did, and if he had come out to Sedgwick on the 12 o'clock train, he was quite capable of answering me in this casual way to throw me off the track. Well, I would try once again. "Excuse me, Mr. Hall, but I am obliged to ask you some personal questions now. Are you engaged to Miss Lloyd?" "I beg your pardon?" His continued request for me to repeat my questions irritated me beyond endurance. Of course it was a bluff to gain time, but he did it so politely I couldn't rebuke him. "Are you engaged to Miss Lloyd?" I repeated. "No, I think not," he said slowly. "She wants to break it off, and I, as a poor man, should not stand in the way of her making a brilliant marriage. She has many opportunities for such, as her uncle often told me, and I should be selfish indeed, now that she herself is poor, to hold her to her promise to me. The hypocrite, to lay on Florence the responsibility for breaking the engagement. Truly, she was well rid of him, and I hoped I could convince her of the fact. "But she is not so poor," I said. "Mr. Philip Crawford told me he intends to provide for her amply, and I am sure that means a fair-sized fortune, for the Crawfords are generous people." Gregory Hall's manner changed. "Did Philip Crawford say that?" he cried. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure, as he said it to me." "Then Florence and I may be happy yet," he said, and as I looked him straight in the eye, he had the grace to look ashamed of himself, and, with a rising color, he continued, "I hope you understand me, Mr. Burroughs. No man could ask a girl to marry him if he knew that meant condemning her to comparative poverty." "No, of course not," I said sarcastically. "Then I assume that, so far as you are concerned, your engagement with Miss Lloyd is not broken?" "By no means. In fact, I could not desert her just now, when there is a sort of cloud over her." "What do you mean?" I thundered. "There's no cloud over her." "Well, you know, the gold bag and the yellow rose leaves." "Be silent. The gold bag has been claimed by its owner, but you are responsible for its presence in this room. You who brought it from the midnight train and left it here. You who also left the late city newspaper here. You who also dropped 2 yellow petals from the rose in your buttonhole." Gregory Hall seemed to turn to stone as he listened to my words. He became white, then ashen gray. His hands clenched his chair arms, and his eyes grew glassy and fixed. I pushed home my advantage. "And therefore, traced by these undeniable evidences, I know that you are the slayer of Joseph Crawford. You killed your friend, your benefactor, your employer, in order that he might not disinherit the girl whose fortune you wished to acquire by marrying her." Though I had spoken in low tones, my own intense emotion made my words emphatic, and as I finished I was perhaps the more excited of the two. For Hall's composure had returned. His face resumed its natural color, his eyes their normal expression, that of cold indifference. "Mr. Burroughs," he said quietly, "you must be insane." "There is no answer to my accusations," I stormed. "I tell you of the most conclusive evidence against yourself, and instead of any attempt to refute it, you mildly remark you are insane. It is you who are insane, Mr. Hall, if you think you can escape arrest and trial for the murder of Joseph Crawford." "Oh, I think I can," was his only answer, with that maddening little smile of his. "Then where were you on Tuesday night?" "Excuse me?" "Where were you on Tuesday night?" "That I refuse to tell, as I have refused before and shall always refuse." "Because you were here, and because you have too much wisdom to try to prove a false alibi." He looked at me half admiringly. "You are right in that," he said. "It is extremely foolish for anyone to fake an alibi, and I certainly never should try to do so." "That's how I know you were here," I replied triumphantly. "You do you? Well, Mr. Burroughs, I don't pretend to misunderstand you, for Miss Lloyd has told me all about Mrs. Cunningham and her bag that she left in the train. But I will say this, if you think I came out on that midnight train, go and ask the conductor. He knows me, and as I often do come out on that train, he may remember that I was not on it that night. And while you are about it, since you consider that late newspaper a clue, also ask him who was on the train that might have come here afterward." If this was bluffing, it was a very clever bluff, and magnificently carried out. Probably his hope was that the conductor could not say definitely as to Hall's presence on the late train, and any other names he might mention would only complicate matters. But before I left I made one more attempt to get at this man's secret. "Mr. Hall," I began, "I am not unfriendly. In fact, for Miss Lloyd's sake, as well as your own, I should like to remove every shadow of suspicion that hovers near either or both of you." "I know that," he said quickly. "Don't think I can't see through your friendliness to Miss Lloyd. But be careful there, Mr. Burroughs. A man does not allow too many friendly glances toward the girl he is engaged to." So he had discovered my secret. Well, perhaps it was a good thing. Now I could fight for Florence more openly if necessary. "You are right, Mr. Hall," I went on. "I hold Miss Lloyd in very high esteem, and I assure you as man to man, that so long as you and she are betrothed, neither of you will have cause to look on me as other than a detective earnest in his work in your behalf." "Thank you," said Hall, a little taken back by my frankness. I went away soon after that, and without quizzing him any further, for though I still suspected him, I realized that he would never say anything to incriminate himself. The theory that the criminal was someone who came in on that midnight train was plausible indeed, but what a scope it offered! Why, a total stranger to Sedgwick might have come and gone entirely unobserved in the crowd. It was with little hope, therefore, that I arranged for an interview with the conductor of the train. He lived in Hunterton, a few stations from West Sedgwick, and after ascertaining by telephone that he could see me the next day, I went to his house. "Well, no," he replied, after thinking over my query a bit. "I don't think Mr. Hall came out from New York that night. I'm almost sure he didn't, because he usually gives me his newspaper as he steps off the train, and I didn't get any extra that night." Of course, this wasn't positive proof that Hall wasn't there, so I asked him to tell me all the West Sedgwick people that he did remember as being on his train that night. He mentioned a dozen or more, but they were nearly all names unknown to me. "Do you remember the Cunninghams being on the train?" I asked. "Those Marathon Park people? Oh, yes. They were a gay party, coming back from a theater supper, I suppose. And that reminds me, Philip Crawford sat right behind the Cunninghams. I forgot him before. Well, I guess that's all the West Sedgwick people I can remember." I went away not much wiser, but with a growing thought that buzzed in my brain. It was absurd, of course, but he had said Philip Crawford had sat right behind Mrs. Cunningham. How, then, could he help seeing the gold bag she left behind when she got out at the station just before West Sedgwick? Indeed, who else could have seen it but the man in the seat directly behind? Even if someone else had picked it up and carried it from the car, Mr. Crawford must have seen it. Moreover, why hadn't he said he was on the train? Why conceal such a simple matter? Again, who had profited by the whole affair? And why had Gregory Hall said, "Ask the conductor who did get off that train"? The rose petals were already explained by Florence. If then Philip Crawford had, much later, come to his brother's with the gold bag and the late newspaper, and had gone away and left them there, and had never told of all this, was there not a new direction in which to look? But Philip Crawford, the dead man's own brother? End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The midnight train. The enormity of suspecting Philip Crawford was so great to my mind that I went at once to the district attorney's office for consultation with him. Mr. Goodrich listened to what I had to say, and then, when I waited for comment, said quietly, "Do you know, Mr. Burroughs, I have thought all along that Philip Crawford was concealing something, but I didn't think, and don't think now, that he has any guilty secret of his own. I rather fancied he might know something that, if told, would be detrimental to Miss Lloyd's cause." "It may be so," I returned, "but I can't see how that would have made him conceal the fact of his having been on that late train Tuesday night. Why, I discussed with him the possibility of Hall's coming out on it, and it would have been only natural to say he was on it and didn't see Hall." "Unless he did see him," remarked the district attorney. "Yes, there's that possibility. He may be shielding Hall for Miss Lloyd's sake, and—" "Let's go see him," suggested Mr. Goodrich. "I believe in the immediate following up of any idea we may have." It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour when we were likely to find Mr. Crawford at home, so we started off at once, and on reaching his house we were told that Mr. Randolph was with him in the library, and that he would see us. So to the library we went, found Mr. Crawford and his lawyer hard at work on the papers of the Joseph Crawford estate. Perhaps it was imagination, but I thought I detected a look of apprehension on Philip Crawford's face as we entered, but he greeted us in his pleasant, simple way and asked us to be seated. "To come right to the point, Mr. Crawford," said the district attorney, "Mr. Burroughs and I are still searching for new light on the tragedy of your brother's death. And now Mr. Burroughs wants to put a few questions to you which may help him in his quest." Philip Crawford looked straight at me with his piercing eyes, and it seemed to me that he straightened himself as for an expected blow. "Yes, Mr. Burroughs," he said courteously. "What is it you want to ask?" So plain and straightforward was his manner that I decided to be equally direct. "Did you come out in that midnight train from New York last Tuesday night?" I began. "I did," he replied in even tones. "While on that train, did you sit behind a lady who left a gold bag in the seat when she got out?" "I did." "Did you pick up that bag and take it away with you?" "I did." "Then, Mr. Crawford, as that is the gold bag that was found in your brother's office, I think you owe a more detailed explanation." To say that the lawyer and the district attorney who heard these questions and answers were astounded is putting it too mildly. They were almost paralyzed with surprise and dismay. To hear these condemning assertions straight from the lips of the man they incriminated was startling indeed. "You are right," said Philip Crawford. "I do owe an explanation, and I shall give it here and now." Although what he was going to say was doubtless a confession, Mr. Crawford's face showed an unmistakable expression of relief. He seemed like a man who had borne a terrible secret around with him for the past week, and was now glad that he was about to impart it to someone else. He spoke very gravely, but with no faltering or hesitation. "This is a solemn confession," he said, turning to his lawyer, "and is made to the district attorney with yourself and Mr. Burroughs as witnesses." Mr. Randolph bowed his head in acknowledgment of this formal statement. "I am a criminal in the eyes of the law," said Mr. Crawford, in an impersonal tone, which I knew he adopted to hide any emotion he might feel. "I have committed a dastardly crime, but I am not the murderer of my brother Joseph." We all felt our hearts lighten of a great load, for it was impossible to disbelieve the calm statement and the clear gaze of those truthful, unafraid eyes. The story I have to tell will sound as if I might have been my brother's slayer, and that is why I assert the contrary at the outset. Pausing here, Mr. Crawford unlocked the drawer of a desk and took out a small pistol which he laid on the table. "That," he said, "is my revolver, and it is the weapon with which my brother was killed." I felt a choking sensation. Philip Crawford's manner was so far removed from a sensational or melodramatic effect that it was doubly impressive. I believed his statement that he did not kill his brother, but what could these further revelations mean? Hall, Florence, young Philip. Whom would Philip Crawford thus shield for a whole week, and then, when forced to do so, expose? "You are making strange declarations, Mr. Crawford," said Lawyer Randolph, who was already white-faced and trembling. "I know it," went on Philip Crawford, "and I trust you three men will hear my story through, and then take such measures as you see fit. This pistol, as I said, is my property. Perhaps about a month ago I took it over to my brother Joseph. He has always been careless of danger, and as he was in the habit of sitting in his office until very late, with the long windows open on a dark veranda, I often told him he ought to keep a weapon in his desk by way of general protection. Then, after there had been a number of burglaries in West Sedgwick, I took the pistol to him, and begged him, as a favor to me, to let it stay in his desk drawer as a precautionary measure. He laughed at my solicitude, but put it away in a drawer, the upper right-hand one, among his business papers. So much for the pistol. Last Tuesday night I came out from New York on that midnight train that reaches West Sedgwick Station at 1 o'clock. In the train I did not notice especially who sat near me, but when I reached our station and started to leave the car, I noticed a gold bag in the seat ahead. I picked it up, and with a half-formed intention of handing it to the conductor, I left the train. But as I stepped off, I did not see the conductor, and though I looked about for him, he did not appear, and the train moved on. I looked in the station, but the ticket agent was not visible, and as the hour was so late, I slipped the bag into my pocket, intending to hand it over to the railroad authorities the next morning. In fact, I thought little about it, for I was very much perturbed over some financial considerations. I had been reading my newspaper all the way out from the city. It was an extra with the account of the steamship accident. Here Mr. Crawford looked at me as much to say, "There's your precious newspaper clue," but his manner was indicative only of sadness and grief. He had no cringing air as of a murderer. However, I merely skimmed the news about the steamer, so interested was I in the stock market reports. I needn't now tell the details, but I knew that Joseph had a corner in XY stock. I was myself heavily invested in it, and I began to realize that I must see Joseph at once, to learn his intended actions for the next day. If he threw his stock on the market, there would be a drop of perhaps 10 points, and I should be a large loser, if indeed I were not entirely wiped out. So I went from the train straight to my brother's home. When I reached the gate, I saw there was a low light in his office, so I went round that way instead of to the front door. As I neared the veranda and went up the steps, I drew from my overcoat pocket the newspaper, and feeling the gold bag there also, I drew that out, thinking to show it to Joseph. As I look back now, I think it occurred to me that the bag might be Florence's. I had seen her carry one like it, but as you can readily understand, I gave no coherent thought to the bag, as my mind was full of the business matter. The French window was open, and I stepped inside. Mr. Crawford paused here, but he gave way to no visible emotion. He was like a man with an inexorable duty to perform, and no wish to stop until it was finished. But truth was stamped unmistakably in every word and every look. Only the desk light was turned on, but that gave light enough for me to see my brother sitting dead in his chair. I satisfied myself that he was really dead, and then, in a sort of a daze, I looked about the room. Though I felt benumbed and half unconscious, physically my thoughts worked rapidly. On the desk before him I saw his will. An irrepressible exclamation from Mr. Randolph was the only sound that greeted this astonishing statement. Yes, and Mr. Crawford took a document from the same drawer whence he had taken the pistol. There is Joseph Crawford's will, leaving all his property to Florence Lloyd. Mechanically, Mr. Randolph took the paper his client passed to him, and after a glance at it, laid it on the table in front of him. "That was my crime," said Philip Crawford solemnly, "and I thank God that I can confess it and make restitution. I must have been suddenly possessed of a devil of a greed. For the moment I saw that will, I knew that if I took it away the property would be mine, and I would then run no danger of being ruined by my stock speculations. I had a dim feeling that I should eventually give all or a large part of the fortune to Florence, but at the moment I was obsessed by evil, and I stole my brother's will." It was an honest confession of an awful crime, but under the spell of that strong, low voice and the upright bearing of that impressive figure, we could not, at the moment, condemn, we could only listen and wait. "Then," the speaker proceeded, "I was seized with the terrific, unreasoning fear that I dare say always besets a malefactor. I had but one thought, to get away and leave the murder to be discovered by some one else. In a sort of subconscious effort at caution, I took my pistol, lest it prove incriminating evidence against me. But in my mad frenzy of fear, I gave no thought to the gold bag or the newspaper. I came home, secreted the will and the revolver, and ever since I have had no doubts as to the existence of a hell. 1,000 times I have been on the point of making this confession, and even had it not been brought about as it has, I must have given way soon. No mortal could stand out long under the pressure of remorse and regret that has been on me this past week. Now, gentlemen, I have told you all. The action you may take in this matter must be of your own choosing. But except for the stigma of past sin, I stand again before the world, with no unconfessed crime upon my conscience. I stole the will, I have restored it, but my hands are clean of the blood of my brother, and I am now free to add my efforts to yours to find the criminal and avenge the crime." He had not raised his voice above those low, even tones in which he had started his recital. He had made no bid for leniency of judgment, but to a man His three hearers rose and held out friendly hands to him as he finished his story. "Thank you," he said simply, as he accepted this mute token of our belief in his word. "I am gratified at your kindly attitude, but I realize none the less what this will all mean for me. Not only myself, but my innocent family must share my disgrace. However, that is part of the wrongdoer's punishment. The results fall not only on his own head, but on the heads and hearts of his loved ones." "Mr. Goodrich," said Mr. Randolph, "I don't know how you look upon this matter from your official viewpoint, but unless you deem it necessary, I should think that this confidence of Mr. Crawford's need never be given out to the public. May we not simply state that the missing will has been found, without any further disclosures?" "I am not asking for any such consideration," said Philip Crawford. "If you decide upon such a course, it will be entirely of your own volition." The district attorney hesitated. "Speaking personally," he said at last, "I may say that I place full credence in Mr. Crawford's story. I am entirely convinced of the absolute truth of all his statements. But speaking officially, I may say that in a court of justice witnesses would be required who could corroborate his words." "But such witnesses are manifestly impossible to procure," said Mr. Randolph. "Certainly they are," I agreed, "and I should like to make this suggestion. Believing as we do in Mr. Crawford's story, it becomes important testimony in the case. Now, if it were made public, it would lose its importance, for it would set ignorant tongues wagging and give rise to absurd and untrue theories, and result in blocking our best meant efforts. So I propose that we keep the matter to ourselves for a time, say a week or a fortnight, keeping Mr. Crawford under surveillance if need be. Then we can work on the case with the benefit of suggestions offered by Mr. Crawford's revelations, and I, for one, think such benefit of immense importance." "That will do," said Mr. Goodrich, whose troubled face had cleared at my suggestion. "You are quite right, Mr. Burroughs, and the surveillance will be a mere empty formality, for a man who has confessed as Mr. Crawford has done is not going to run away from the consequences of his confession." "I am not," said Mr. Crawford, "and I am grateful for this respite from unpleasant publicity. I will take my punishment when it comes, but I feel with Mr. Burroughs that more progress can be made if what I have told you is not at once generally known." "Where now does suspicion point?" It was Mr. Randolph who spoke. His legal mind had already gone ahead of the present occasion, and was applying the new facts to the old theories. "To Gregory Hall," said the district attorney. "Wait," said I. "If Mr. Crawford left the bag and the newspaper in the office, we have no evidence whatever that Mr. Hall came out on that late train." "Nor did he need to," said Mr. Goodrich, who was thinking rapidly. "He might have come on an earlier train, or for that matter, not by train at all. He might have come out from town in a motor car." This was possible, but it did not seem to me probable. A motor car was a conspicuous way for a man to come out from New York and return, if he wished to keep his visit secret. Still, he could have left the car at some distance from the house and walked the rest of the way. "Did Mr. Hall know that a revolver was kept in Mr. Crawford's desk drawer?" I asked. "He did," replied Philip Crawford. "He was present when I took my pistol over to Joseph." "Then," said Mr. Goodrich, "the case looks to me very serious against Mr. Hall. We have proved his motive, his opportunity, and his method, or rather, means of committing the crime. Add to this his unwillingness to tell where he was on Tuesday night, and I see sufficient justification for issuing a warrant for his arrest." "I don't know," said Philip Crawford, "whether such immediate measures are advisable. I don't want to influence you, Mr. Goodrich, but suppose we see Mr. Hall and question him a little. Then, if it seems to you best, arrest him." "That is a good suggestion, Mr. Crawford," said the district attorney. "We can have a sort of court of inquiry by ourselves, and perhaps Mr. Hall will, by his own words, justify or relieve our suspicions." I went away from Mr. Crawford's house and went straight to Florence Lloyd's. I did this almost involuntarily. Perhaps if I had stopped to think, I might have realized that it did not devolve upon me to tell her of Philip Crawford's confession. But I wanted to tell her myself, because I hoped that from her manner of hearing the story I could learn something. I still believed that in trying to shield Hall, she had not yet been entirely frank with me, and at any rate I wanted to be the one to tell her of the important recent discovery. When I arrived, I found Mr. Porter in the library talking with Florence. At first I hesitated about telling my story before him, and then I remembered that he was one of the best of Florence's friends and advisers, and moreover a man of sound judgment and of great perspicacity. Needless to say, they were both amazed and almost stunned by the recital, and it was some time before they could take in the situation in all its bearing. We had a long, grave conversation, for the three of us were not influenced so much by the sensationalness of this new development as by the question of whither it led. Of course, the secret was as safe with these two as with those of us who had heard it directly from Philip Crawford's lips. "I understand Philip Crawford's action," said Mr. Porter very seriously. "In the first place, he was not quite himself, owing to the sudden shock of seeing his brother dead before his eyes. Also, the sight of his own pistol, with which the deed had evidently been committed, unnerved him. It was an almost unconscious nervous action which made him take the pistol, and it was a sort of subconscious mental working that resulted in his abstracting the will. Had he been in full possession of his brain faculty, he could not have done either. He did wrong, of course, but he has made a full restitution, and his wrongdoing should not only be forgiven, but forgotten." I looked at Mr. Porter in unfeigned admiration. Truly he had expressed noble sentiments, and his must be a broadly noble nature that could show such a spirit toward his fellow man. Florence, too, gave him an appreciative glance, but her mind seemed to be working on the possibilities of the new evidence. "Then it would seem," she said slowly, "that as I, myself, was in Uncle's office at about 11 o'clock, and as Uncle Philip was there a little after 1 o'clock, whoever killed Uncle Joseph came and went between those hours." "Yes," I said, and I knew that her thoughts had flown to Gregory Hall. "But I think there are no trains in and out of West Sedgwick between those hours." "He need not have come in a train," said Florence slowly, as if simply voicing her thoughts. "Don't attempt to solve the mystery, Florence," said Mr. Porter in his decided way. "Leave that for those who make it their business. Mr. Burroughs, I am sure, will do all he can, and it is not for you to trouble your already sad heart with these anxieties. Give it up, my girl, for it means only useless exertion on your part." "And on my part, too, I fear, Mr. Porter," I said. "Without wishing to shirk my duty, I can't help feeling I'm up against a problem that to me is insoluble. It is my desire, since the case is baffling, to call in talent of a higher order, Fleming Stone, for instance." Mr. Porter gave me a sudden glance, and it was a glance I could not understand. For an instant it seemed to me that he showed fear, and this thought was instantly followed by the impression that he feared for Florence. And then I chid myself for my foolish heart that made every thought that entered my brain lead to Florence Lloyd. With my mind in this commotion, I scarcely heard Mr. Porter's words. "No, no," he was saying. "We need no other or cleverer detective than you, Mr. Burroughs. If, as Florence says, the murderer was clever enough to come between those 2 hours and go away again leaving no sign, he is probably clever enough so to conceal his coming and going that he may not be traced." "But, Mr. Porter," I observed, "they say murderer will out." And again that strange look came into his eyes. Surely it was an expression of fear. But he only said, "Then you're the man to bring that result about, Mr. Burroughs. I have great confidence in your powers as a detective." He took his leave, and I was not sorry, for I wanted an opportunity to see Florence alone. "I am so sorry," she said, and for the first time I saw tears in her dear, beautiful eyes, "to hear that about Uncle Philip. But Mr. Porter was right. He was not himself, or he never could have done it. It was an awful thing for him to find his brother as he did, and go away and leave him so. Awful indeed, but the Crawfords have always been strange in their ways. I have never seen one of them show emotion or sentiment upon any occasion. "Now you are again an heiress," I said, suddenly realizing the fact. "Yes," she said, but her tone indicated that her fortune brought in its train many perplexing troubles and many grave questions. "Forgive me," I began, "if I am unwarrantably intrusive, but I must say this. Affairs are so changed now that new dangers and troubles may arise for you. If I can help you in any way, will you let me do so? Will you confide in me and trust me? And will you remember that in so doing you are not putting yourself under the slightest obligation?" She looked at me very earnestly for a moment, and then without replying directly to my question, she said in a low tone, "You are the very best friend I have ever had." "Florence!" I cried, but even as she had spoken, she had gone softly out of the room, and with a quiet joy in my heart I went away. That afternoon I was summoned to Mr. Philip Crawford's house to be present at the informal court of inquiry which was to interrogate Gregory Hall. Hall was summoned by telephone, and not long after he arrived. He was cool and collected as usual, and I wondered if even his arrest would disturb his calm. "We are pursuing the investigation of Mr. Crawford's death, Mr. Hall," the district attorney began, "and we wish, in the course of our inquiries, to ask some questions of you." "Certainly, sir," said Gregory Hall, with an air of polite indifference. "And I may as well tell you at the outset," went on Mr. Goodrich, a little irritated at the young man's attitude, "that you, Mr. Hall, are under suspicion." "Yes?" said Hall interrogatively. "But I was not here that night." "That's just the point, sir. You say you were not here, but you refuse to say where you were. Now, wherever you may have been that night, a frank admission of it will do you less harm than this incriminating concealment of the truth." "In that case," said Hall easily, "I suppose I may as well tell you. But first, since you practically accuse me, may I ask if any new developments have been brought to light?" "One has," said Mr. Goodrich. "The missing will has been found." "What!" cried Hall, unable to conceal his satisfaction at this information. "Yes," said Mr. Goodrich coldly, disgusted at the plainly apparent mercenary spirit of the man. "Yes, the will of Mr. Joseph Crawford, which bequeaths the bulk of his estate to Miss Lloyd, is safe in Mr. Randolph's possession. But that fact in no way affects your connection with the case, or our desire to learn where you were on Tuesday night." "Pardon me, Mr. Goodrich, I didn't hear all that you said." Bluffing again, thought I, and truly it seemed to me rather a clever way to gain time for consideration, and yet let his answers appear spontaneous. The district attorney repeated his question, and now Gregory Hall answered deliberately. "I still refuse to tell you where I was. It in no way affects the case. It is a private matter of my own. I was in New York City from the time I left West Sedgwick at 6 o'clock on Monday until I returned the next morning. Further than that, I will give no account of my doings." "Then we must assume you were engaged in some occupation of which you are ashamed to tell." Hall shrugged his shoulders. "You may assume what you choose," he said. "I was not here. I had no hand in Mr. Crawford's death, and knew nothing of it until my return next day." "You knew Mr. Crawford kept a revolver in his desk. You must know it is not there now." Hall looked troubled. "I know nothing about the revolver," he said. "I saw it the day Mr. Philip Crawford brought it there, but I have never seen it since." This sounded honest enough, but if he were the criminal, he would of course make these same avowals. "Well, Mr. Hall," said the district attorney, with an air of finality, "we suspect you. We hold that you had motive, opportunity, and means for this crime. Therefore, unless you can prove an alibi for Tuesday night, and bring witnesses to prove where you were, we must arrest you on suspicion for the murder of Joseph Crawford." Gregory Hall deliberated silently for a few moments. Then he said, "I am innocent, but I persist in my refusal to allow intrusion on my private and personal affairs. Arrest me if you will, but you will yet learn your mistake." I can never explain it, even to myself, but something in the man's tone and manner convinced me, even against my own will, that he spoke the truth. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Fleming Stone. The news of Gregory Hall's arrest flew through the town like wildfire. That evening I went to call on Florence Lloyd, though I had little hope that she would see me. To my surprise, however, she welcomed me almost eagerly, and though I knew she wanted to see me only for what legal help I might give her, I was glad even of this. And yet her manner was far from impersonal. Indeed, she showed a slight embarrassment in my presence, which, if I had dared, I should have been glad to think meant a growing interest in our friendship. "You have heard all?" I asked, knowing from her manner that she had. "Yes," she replied. "Mr. Hall was here for dinner, and then he went away to—" "To prison," I finished quietly. "Florence, I cannot think he is the murderer of your uncle." If she noticed this, my first use of her Christian name, she offered no remonstrance, and I went on. "To be sure, they have proved that he had motive, means, opportunity, and all that, but it is only indefinite evidence. If he would but tell where he was on Tuesday night, he could so easily free himself. Why will he not tell?" "I don't know," she said, looking thoughtful, "but I cannot think he was here, either. When he said good bye to me to night, he did not seem at all apprehensive. He only said he was arrested wrongfully, and that he would soon be set free again. You know his way of taking everything casually." "Yes, I do. And now that you are your uncle's heiress, I suppose he no longer wishes to break the engagement between you and him?" I said this bitterly, for I loathed the nature that could thus turn about in accordance with the wheel of fortune. To my surprise, she too spoke bitterly. "Yes," she said, "he insists now that we are engaged, and that he never really wanted to break it. He has shown me positively that it is my money that attracts him, and if it were not that, I don't want to see to desert him now when he is in trouble." She paused, and my heart beat rapidly. Could it be that at last she saw Gregory Hall as he really was, and that his mercenary spirit had killed her love for him? At least she had intimated this, and forcing myself to be content with that for the present, I said, "Would you then, if you could, get him out of this trouble?" "Gladly. I do not think he killed Uncle Joseph, but I am sure I do not know who did. Do you?" "I haven't the least idea," I answered honestly, for there, in Florence Lloyd's presence, gazing into the depths of her clear eyes, my last faint suspicion of her wrongdoing faded away. And it is this total lack of suspicion that makes the case so simple, and therefore so difficult. A more complicated case offers some points on which to build a theory. I do not blame Mr. Goodrich for suspecting Mr. Hall, for there seems to be no one else to suspect. Just then Mr. Lemuel Porter dropped in for an evening call. Of course, we talked over the events of the day, and Mr. Porter was almost vehement in his denunciation of the sudden move of the district attorney. "It's absurd," he said, "utterly absurd. Gregory Hall never did the thing. I've known Hall for years, and he isn't that sort of a man. I believe Philip Crawford's story, of course, but the murderer, who came into the office after Florence's visit to her uncle, and before Philip arrived, was some stranger from out of town, some man whom none of us know, who had some grievance against Joseph, and who deliberately came and went during that midnight hour." I agreed with Mr. Porter. I had thought all along it was someone unknown to the Sedgwick people, but someone well known to Joseph Crawford, for had it been an ordinary burglar, the victim would have at least have raised a protecting hand. "Of course Hall will be set free at once," continued Mr. Porter, "but to arrest him was a foolish thing to do." "Still, he ought to prove his alibi," I said. "Very well, then, make him prove it. Give him the third degree, if necessary, and find out where he was on Tuesday night." "I doubt if they could get it out of him," I observed, "if he continues determined not to tell." "Then he deserves his fate," said Mr. Porter, a little petulantly. "He can free himself by a word. If he refuses to do so, it is his own business." "But I'd like to help him," said Florence, almost timidly. "Is there no way I can do so, Mr. Burroughs?" "Indeed there is," I said. "You are a rich woman now. Use some of your wealth to employ the services of Fleming Stone, and I can assure you the truth will be discovered." "Indeed I will," said Florence. "Please send for him at once." "Nonsense," said Mr. Porter. "It isn't necessary at all. Mr. Burroughs here and young Parmalee are all the detectives we need. Get Hall to free himself, as he can easily do, and then set to work in earnest to run down the real villain." "No, Mr. Porter," said Florence with firmness. "Gregory will not tell his secret, whatever it is. I know his stubborn nature. He'll stay in prison until he's freed, as he is sure he will be. But he won't tell what he has determined not to divulge. No, I'm glad I can do something definite at last toward avenging Uncle Joseph's death. Please send for Mr. Stone, Mr. Burroughs, and I will gladly pay his fees and expenses." Mr. Porter expostulated further, but to no avail. Florence insisted on sending for the great detective. So I sent for him. He came 2 days later, and in the interval nothing further had been learned from Gregory Hall. The man was an enigma to me. He was calm and impassive as ever, courteous though never cordial, and apparently without the least apprehension of ever being convicted for the crime which had caused his arrest. Indeed, he acted just as an innocent man would act, innocent of the murder, that is, but resolved to conceal his whereabouts on Tuesday night, whatever that resolve might imply. To me, it did not imply crime. Something he wished to conceal, certainly, but I could not think a criminal would act so. A criminal is usually ready with an alibi, whether it can be proved or not. When Fleming Stone arrived, I met him at the station and took him at once to the inn, where I had engaged rooms for him. We first had a long conversation alone, in which I told him everything I knew concerning the murder. "When did it happen?" he asked, for though he had read some of the newspaper accounts, the date had escaped him. I told him, and added, "Why, I was called here just after I left you at the Metropolis Hotel that morning. Don't you remember? You deduced a lot of information from a pair of shoes which were waiting to be cleaned." "Yes, I remember," said Stone, smiling a little at the recollection. "And I tried to make similar deductions from the gold bag and the newspaper, but I couldn't do it. I bungled matters every time. My deductions are mostly from the witness's looks or tones when giving evidence." "On the stand?" "Not necessarily on the stand. I've learned much from talking to the principals informally." "And where do your suspicions point?" "Nowhere. I've suspected Florence Lloyd and Gregory Hall in turn and in collusion, but now I suspect neither of them." "Why not, Hall?" "His manner is too frank and unconcerned." "A good bluff for a criminal to use." "Then he won't tell where he was that night." "If he is the murderer, he can't tell. A false alibi is so easily riddled. It's rather clever to keep doggedly silent, but what does he say is his reason?" "He won't give any reason. He has determined to keep up that calm, indifferent pose, and though it is aggravating, I must admit it serves his purpose well." "How did they find him the morning after the murder?" "Let me see. I believe the coroner said he telephoned first to Hall's club, but the steward said Hall didn't stay there as there was no vacant room, and that he had stayed all night at a hotel." "What hotel?" "I don't know. The coroner asked the steward, but he didn't know." "Didn't he find out from Hall afterward?" "I don't know, Stone. Perhaps the coroner asked him, but if he did, I doubt if Hall told him. It didn't seem to me important." "Burroughs, my son, you should have learned every detail of Hall's doings that night." "But if he were not in West Sedgwick, what difference could it possibly make where he was?" "One never knows what difference anything will make until the difference is made. That's oracular, but it means more than it sounds. However, go on." I went on, and I even told him what Florence had told me concerning the possibility of Hall's interest in another woman. "At last we are getting to it," said Stone. "Why in the name of all good detectives didn't you hunt up that other woman?" "But she is perhaps only a figment of Miss Lloyd's brain." "Figments of the brains of engaged young ladies are apt to have a solid foundation of flesh and blood. I think much could be learned concerning Mr. Hall's straying fancy. But tell me again about his attitude toward Miss Lloyd in the successive developments of the will question." Fleming Stone was deeply interested as I rehearsed how, when Florence was supposed to be penniless, he wished to break the engagement. When Philip Crawford offered to provide for her, Mr. Hall was uncertain. But when the will was found and Florence was known to inherit all her uncle's property, then Gregory Hall not only held her to the engagement, but said he had never wished to break it. Said Stone, "pretty clear that the young man is a fortune hunter." "He is," I agreed. "I felt sure of that from the first." "And he is now under arrest, calmly waiting for someone to prove his innocence so he can marry the heiress." "That's about the size of it," I said. "But I don't think Florence is quite as much in love with him as she was. She seems to have realized his mercenary spirit." Perhaps an undue interest in my voice or manner disclosed to this astute man the state of my own affections, for he gave me a quizzical glance and said, "Ho, ho! Sits to win in that quarter." "Yes," I said, determined to be frank with him, "it does. I want you to free Gregory Hall if he's innocent. Then, if for any reason Miss Lloyd sees fit to dismiss him, I shall most certainly try to win her affections. As I came to this determination when she was supposed to be penniless, I can scarcely be accused of fortune hunting myself." "Indeed you can't, old chap. You're not that sort. Well, let's go see your district attorney and his precious prisoner, and see what's to be done." We went to the district attorney's office, and later, accompanied by him and Mr. Randolph, we visited Gregory Hall. As I had expected, Mr. Hall wore the same unperturbed manner he always showed, and when Fleming Stone was introduced, Hall greeted him coldly, with absolutely no show of interest in the man or his work. Fleming Stone's own kindly face took on a slight expression of hauteur as he noticed his reception, but he said pleasantly enough, "I am here in an effort to aid in establishing your innocence, Mr. Hall." "I beg your pardon," said Hall listlessly. I wondered whether this asking to have a remark repeated was merely a foolish habit of Hall's, or whether, as I had heretofore guessed, it was a ruse to gain time. Fleming Stone looked at him a little more sharply as he repeated his remark in clear, even tones. "Thank you," said Hall pleasantly enough. "I shall be glad to be free from this unjust suspicion." "And as a bit of friendly advice," went on Stone, "I strongly urge that you reveal to us, confidentially, where you were on Tuesday night." Hall looked the speaker straight in the eye. "That," he said, "I must still refuse to do." Fleming Stone rose and walked toward the window. "I think," he said, "the proof of your innocence may depend upon this point." Gregory Hall turned his head and followed Stone with his eyes. "What did you say, Mr. Stone?" he asked quietly. The detective returned to his seat. "I said," he replied, "that the proof of your innocence might depend on your telling this secret of yours. But I begin to think now you will be freed from suspicion whether you tell it or not." Instead of looking glad at this assurance, Gregory Hall gave a start, and an expression of fear came into his eyes. "What do you mean?" he said. "Have you any letters in your pocket, Mr. Hall?" went on Fleming Stone in a suave voice. "Yes, several. Why?" "I do not ask you to read them. Merely show me the lot." With what seemed to be an unwilling but enforced movement, Mr. Hall drew 4 or 5 letters from his breast pocket and handed them to Fleming Stone. "They've all been looked over, Mr. Stone," said the district attorney, "and they have no bearing on the matter of the crime." "Oh, I don't want to read them," said the detective. He ran over the lot carelessly, not taking the sheets from the envelopes, and returned them to their owner. Gregory Hall looked at him as if fascinated. What revelation was this man about to make? "Mr. Hall," Fleming Stone began, "I've no intention of forcing your secret from you, but I shall ask you some questions, and you may do as you like about answering them. First, you refused to tell where you were during the night last Tuesday. I take it you mean you refused to tell how or where you spent the evening. Now, will you tell us where you lodged that night?" "I fail to see any reason for telling you," answered Hall, after a moment's thought. "I have said I was in New York City. That is enough." "The reason you may as well tell us," went on Mr. Stone, "is because it is a very simple matter for us to find out. You doubtless were at some hotel, and you went there because you could not get a room at your club. In fact, this was stated when the coroner telephoned for you the morning after the murder. I mean, it was stated that the club bedrooms were all occupied. I assume, therefore, that you lodged at some hotel, and as a canvass of the city hotels would be a simple matter, you may as well save us that trouble." "Oh, very well," said Gregory Hall sullenly. "Then I did spend the night at a hotel. It was the Metropolis Hotel, and you will find my name duly on the register." "I have no doubt of it," said Stone pleasantly. "Now that you have told us this, have you any objection to telling us at what time you returned to the hotel after your evening's occupation, whatever it may have been?" Said Hall abstractedly. He turned his head as he spoke, and Fleming Stone threw me a quizzical smile which I didn't in the least understand. "You may as well tell us," said Stone, after he had repeated his question, "for if you withhold it, the night clerk can give us this information." "Well," said Hall, who now looked distinctly sulky, "I don't remember exactly, but I think I turned in somewhere between 12 and 1 o'clock." "And as it was a late hour, you slept rather late next morning," suggested Stone. "Oh, I don't know. I was at Mr. Crawford's New York office by 10:30. "A strange coincidence, Burroughs," said Fleming Stone, turning to me. Beg pardon?" said Hall, turning his head also. "Mr. Hall," said Stone, suddenly facing him again, "are you deaf? Why do you ask to have remarks repeated?" Hall looked slightly apologetic. "I am a little deaf," he said, "but only in one ear, and only at times, or rather, it is worse at times. If I have a cold, for instance." "Or in damp weather," said Stone. "Mr. Hall, I have questioned you enough. I will now tell these gentlemen, since you refuse to do so, where you were on the night of Mr. Crawford's murder. You were not in West Sedgwick or near it. You are absolutely innocent of the crime or any part in it." Gregory Hall straightened up perceptibly, like a man exonerated from all blame. But he quailed again as Fleming Stone, looking straight at him, continued, "You left West Sedgwick at 6 that evening, as you have said. You registered at the Metropolis Hotel after learning that you could not get a room at your club. And then you went over to Brooklyn to meet or call on a young woman living in that borough. You took her back to New York to the theater or some such entertainment, and afterward escorted her back to her home. The young woman wore a street costume, by which I mean a cloth gown without a train. You did not have a cab, but, after leaving the car, you walked for a rather long distance in Brooklyn. It was raining, and you were both under one umbrella. Am I correct so far?" At last Gregory Hall's calm was disturbed. He looked at Fleming Stone as at a supernatural being, and small wonder, for the truth of Stone's statements was evident from Hall's amazement at them. You saw us?" he gasped. "No, I didn't see you. It is merely a matter of observation, deduction, and memory. You recollect the muddy shoes?" he added, turning to me. Did I recollect? Well, rather, and it certainly was a coincidence that we had chanced to examine those shoes that morning at the hotel. As for Mr. Randolph and the district attorney, they were quite as much surprised as Hall. "Can you prove this astonishing story, Mr. Stone?" asked Mr. Goodrich, with an incredulous look. "Oh, yes, in lots of ways," returned Stone. "For one thing, Mr. Hall has in his pocket now a letter from the young lady. The whole matter is of no great importance, except as it proves Mr. Hall was not in West Sedgwick that night, and so is not the murderer." "But why conceal so simple a matter? Why refuse to tell of the episode?" asked Mr. Randolph. "Because," and now Fleming Stone looked at Hall with accusation in his glance, "because Mr. Hall is very anxious that his fiancée shall not know of his intentions to the young lady in Brooklyn." "Oh, ho!" said Mr. Goodrich, with a sudden enlightenment. "I see it all now. Is it the truth, Mr. Hall? Did you go to Brooklyn and back that night, as Mr. Stone has described?" Gregory Hall fidgeted in an embarrassed way, but unable to escape the piercing gaze of Stone's eyes, he admitted grudgingly that the detective had told the truth, adding, "But it's wizardry. That's what it is. How could he know?" "I had reason for suspicion," said Stone, "and when I found you were deaf in your right ear, and that you had in your pocket a letter addressed in a feminine hand and postmarked Brooklyn, I was sure." "It's all true," said Hall slowly. "You have the facts all right. But unless you have had me shadowed, will you tell me how you knew it all?" And then Fleming Stone told of his observations and deductions when we noticed the muddied shoes at the Metropolis Hotel that morning. "But," he said as he concluded, "when I hastily adjudged the young lady to be deaf in the left ear, I see now I was mistaken. As soon as I realized Mr. Hall himself is deaf in the right ear, especially so in damp or wet weather, I saw that it fitted the case as well as if the lady had been deaf in her left ear. Then a note in his pocket from a lady in Brooklyn made me quite sure I was right." "But, Mr. Stone," said Lawyer Randolph, "it is very astonishing that you should make those deductions from those shoes, and then come out here and meet the owner of the shoes." "It seems more remarkable than it really is, Mr. Randolph," was the response, "for I am continually observing whatever comes to my notice. Hundreds of my deductions are never verified, or even thought of again, so it is not so strange that now and then one should prove of use in my work." "Well," said the district attorney, "it seems wonderful to me, but now that Mr. Hall has proved his alibi, or rather, Mr. Stone has proved it for him, we must begin anew our search for the real criminal." "One moment," said Gregory Hall. "As you know, gentlemen, I endeavored to keep this little matter of my going to Brooklyn a secret. As it has no possible bearing on the case of Mr. Crawford, may I ask of you to respect my desire that you say nothing about it?" "For my part," said the district attorney, "I am quite willing to grant Mr. Hall's request. I have put him to unnecessary trouble and embarrassment by having him arrested, and I shall be glad to do him this favor that he asks, by way of amends." But Mr. Randolph seemed reluctant to make the required promise, and Fleming Stone looked at Hall and said nothing. Then I spoke out, perhaps with scant courtesy. I said, "I, for one, refuse to keep this revelation a secret. It was discovered by the detective engaged by Miss Lloyd. Therefore, I think Miss Lloyd is entitled to the knowledge we have thus gained." Mr. Randolph looked at me with approval. He was a good friend of Florence Lloyd, and he was of no mind to hide from her something which it might be better for her to know. Gregory Hall set his lips together in a way which argued no pleasant feelings toward me, but he said nothing then. He was forthwith released from custody, and the rest of us separated, having arranged to meet that evening at Miss Lloyd's home to discuss matters. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The disclosure. Except the half hour required for a hasty dinner, Fleming Stone devoted the intervening time to looking over the reports of the coroner's inquest, and in asking me questions about all the people who were connected with the affair. "Burroughs," he said at last, "everyone who is interested in Joseph Crawford's death has suspected Gregory Hall, except one person. Not everybody said they suspected him, but they did all the same. Even Miss Lloyd wasn't sure that Hall wasn't the criminal. Now, there's just one person who declares that Hall did not do it, and that he is not implicated. Why should this person feel so sure of Hall's innocence? And furthermore, my boy, here are a few more important questions. In which drawer of the desk was the revolver kept?" "The upper right-hand drawer," I replied. "I mean, what else was in that drawer?" "Oh, important, valuable memoranda of Mr. Crawford's stocks and bonds." "Do you mean stock certificates and actual bonds?" "No, merely lists and certain data referring to them. The certificates themselves were in the bank." "And the will, where had that been kept?" "In the drawer on the other side of the desk. I know all these things because with the lawyer and Mr. Philip Crawford I have been through all the papers of the estate." "Well, then, Burroughs, let us build up the scene. Mr. Joseph Crawford, after returning from his lawyer's that night, goes to his office. Naturally, he takes out his will that he thinks of changing, and, we'll say, it is lying on his desk when Mr. Lemuel Porter calls. He talks of other matters, and the will still lies there unheeded. It is there when Miss Lloyd comes down later. She has said so. It remains there until much later, when Philip Crawford comes, and, after discovering that his brother is dead, sees the will still on the desk, and takes it away with him, and also sees the pistol on the desk and takes that too. Now, granting that the murderer came between the time Miss Lloyd left the office and the time Philip Crawford came there, then it is while the murderer was present that the drawer which held the pistol was opened, the pistol taken out, and the murder committed. Since Mr. Joseph Crawford showed no signs of fear of violence, the murderer must have been, not a burglar or an unwelcome intruder, but a friend or an acquaintance at least. His visit must have been the reason for opening that drawer, and that, not to get the pistol, but to look at or discuss the papers contained in that drawer. The pistol, thus disclosed, was temptingly near the hand of the visitor, and for some reason connected with the papers in that drawer. The pistol was used by the visitor suddenly, unpremeditatedly, but with deadly intent at the moment. "But who?" I began. "Hush," he said. "I see it all now, or almost all. Let us go to Philip Crawford's at once, before it is time to go to Miss Lloyd's." We did so, and Fleming Stone, in a short business talk with Mr. Crawford, learned all that he wanted to know. Then we three went over to Florence Lloyd's home. Awaiting us were several people, the district attorney, of course, and Lawyer Randolph, also Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Porter, who had been asked to be present. Gregory Hall was there, too, and from his crestfallen expression, I couldn't help thinking that he had had an unsatisfactory interview with Florence. As we all sat round the library, Fleming Stone was the principal speaker. He said, "I have come here at Miss Lloyd's request to discover, if possible, the murderer of her uncle, Mr. Joseph Crawford. I have learned the identity of the assassin, and if you all wish me to, I will now divulge it." "We do wish you to, Mr. Stone," said Mr. Goodrich, and his voice trembled a little, for he knew not where the blow might fall. But after Fleming Stone's wonderful detective work in the case of Gregory Hall, the district attorney felt full confidence in his powers. Sitting quietly by the library table, with his eyes on all the company upon him, Fleming Stone said, in effect, to them just what he had said to me. He told of the revolver in the drawer with the financial papers. He told how the midnight visitor must have been some friend or neighbor, whose coming would in no way startle or alarm Mr. Crawford, and whose interest in the question of stocks was desperate. And then Fleming Stone turned suddenly to Lemuel Porter and said, "Shall I go on, Mr. Porter, or will you confess here and now?" It was as if a thunderbolt had fallen. Hitherto unsuspected, the guilt of Lemuel Porter was now apparent beyond all doubt. White-faced and shaking, his burning eyes glared at Fleming Stone. "What are you?" he whispered, in hoarse, hissing tones. "I feared you, and I was right to fear you. I have heard of you before. I tried to prevent your coming here, but I could not. And I knew when you came that I was doomed, doomed. Yes," he went on, looking around at the startled faces. "Yes, I killed Joseph Crawford. If I had not, he would have ruined me financially. Randolph knows that, and Philip Crawford, too. I had no thought of murder in my heart. I came here late that night to renew the request I had made in my earlier visit that evening, that Joseph Crawford would unload his XY stock gradually, and in that way save me. I had overtraded. I had pyramided my paper profits until my affairs were in such a state that a sudden drop of 10 points would wipe me out entirely. But Joseph Crawford was adamant to my entreaties. He said he would see to it that at the opening of the market the next morning, XY stock should be hammered down out of sight. Details are unnecessary. You lawyers and financial men understand. It was his power to ruin or to save me, and he chose to ruin me. I know why, but that concerns no one here. Then, as by chance, he moved the paper in the drawer, and I saw the pistol. In a moment of blind rage, I grasped it and shot him. Death was instantaneous, like one in a dream. I laid down the pistol and came away. I was saved, but at what cost? No one, I think, saw me come or go. I was afterward puzzled to know what became of the pistol and of the will which lay on the desk when I was there. These matters have since been explained. Philip Crawford is as much a criminal as I. I shot a man, but he robbed the dead. He has confessed and made restitution, so he merits no punishment. In the nature of things, I cannot do that, but I can at least cheat the gallows." With these words, Mr. Porter put something into his mouth and swallowed it. Several people started toward him in dismay, but he waved them back, saying, "Too late. Goodbye, all. If possible, do not let my wife know the truth. Can't you tell her I died of heart failure or something like that?" The poison he had taken was of quick effect. Though a doctor was telephoned for at once, Mr. Porter was dead before he came. Everything was now made clear, and Fleming Stone's work in West Sedgwick was done. I was chagrined, for I felt that all he had discovered I ought to have found out for myself. But as I glanced at Florence and saw her lovely eyes fixed on me, I knew that one reason I had failed in my work was because of her distracting influence on it. "Take me away from here," she said, and I gently led her from the library. We went into the small drawing room, and unable to restrain my eagerness, I said, "Tell me, dear, have you broken with Hall?" "Yes," she said, looking up shyly into my face. I learned from his own lips the story of the Brooklyn girl. Then I knew that he really loves her, but wanted to marry me for my fortune. This knowledge was enough for me. I realize now that I never loved Gregory, and I have told him so. "And you do love somebody else?" I whispered ecstatically. "Oh, Florence, I know this is not the time or the place, but just tell me, dear, if you ever love anyone, it will be—" "You," she murmured softly, and I was content. End of chapter 21. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells.